So let me give you a quick warning before we get into this. Um, Relative to the stuff we've been talking about so far about ethics, this lecture might seem a little bit strange. It's very complex, but it involves two questions that have been central to how we think about ethics for the last 200 years, probably. These questions have increased in their relevance over the last 50, 40, or even 10 years. One of these is all truth relative? Now, we saw for Aristotle that the truth is relative to a certain degree, meaning that it's relative to my culture and my circumstance. But Aristotle still thought there were rational rules that control how people ought to behave. We'll see that for Kant, the relativity of claims about ethics is also set in rules. We know that truth will be relative because truth is a matter of fitting into the motivation. The motivation must be an ethical motivation for my action to be ethical. So truth is relative in that sense, even for ethics for Kant. Another big question, which we might not always think of as an ethical question, is just this question of, do scientific laws determine our fate? Science has emerged next to things like ethics or even psychology to explain our behavior. And this might put some pressure on how we think about what it means to be a person, how we think about our own freedom. And this discussion about Kant will help us to think through that question as well. If these ideas sound strange, that's okay. They may take some time. So a review for Kant from what we've done already. We know that for Kant, being good is a matter of having a good will. We know that a good will is a desire to do what is right. And hopefully after last week, all of that kind of makes sense, but we haven't said specifically, what does the good will want other than to do what's right? We need more guidance than that. Now, one thing that we'll see this week is that Kant wants to say that moral laws must be universalized. That means universal, applied everywhere and to everyone who's in the same circumstance, if they're going to make sense or be moral rules at all. So we know that explanation of the physical world, that's likely to involve moral laws, right? We're always thinking about things like E equals mc squared and the principle of gravity and things like that as explaining the physical world. But Kant also thinks that explanation of our duty, which is morally what we ought to do, also has to involve universal laws in order to make sense. So let's think about that in the ordinary physical world. We have things that happen, right? Space shuttles go to the moon. Well, not yet, but someday. Humans go to the moon using the laws of physics. Newton, the famous apple fell on his head, and he said, why did it fall? And the answer is something like the principle of universal gravitation. Now, causation in the physical world then happens, we could say, because of physical laws. Gravity caused the apple to fall. And so the world becomes explained according to these universal laws of nature. Causation can only be explained on Kant's view if there are universal laws behind events that happen. So let's think of an example of this. So let's assume that we're playing pool and I'm an expert pool player and I successfully beat someone else, or even I'm learning the principles at all. Why does the very ability to play pool require laws of physics? Seems like a strange thing to say, but really there would be no game of pool without physics. Why is that? Michael, it looks like you're talking, but you're also muted.
Let's see. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. Well, what I was thinking is everything in a game of pool is a physical object that has to follow physical rules of the physical realm. Like, so in order to play, you have to some extent acknowledge that when one ball hits another, they're going to bounce equal force, reactionary things. They all play by the same rules.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Anyone else want to add to that? Why would there be no game of pool, no experts in pool, if there were no physical laws? Why are physical laws and laws of physics necessary for there to even be pool as a game of skill?
It weeds out those who can calculate the outcome and those who can't.
Yeah, that's well put as well. Well put for both of you. Yeah, there's no point in learning how to play pool if there aren't laws of physics that determine every time one ball strikes another ball, how the other balls will move relative to the first. There's laws of momentum. There's things like the angle of trajectory and the angle of impact, the elasticity of the balls. All of these things affect and determine why the same kind of a pool shot will have the same effect every time, neglecting things like inconsistencies in the pool surface or something like that. But in theory, even those inconsistencies are explainable in laws of physics. So if we say why someone is a better pool player than another, or why that person consistently wins, there's no way to talk about that, or even why when I hit the light ball into the 12 ball, it went straight. There's no way to explain anything that happens in pool without intuitively, we don't have to be experts in physics, but without at least intuitively realizing that there are laws which determine that every time these two physical things interact, they follow the exact same principles, and so the same thing would happen. If there were no physical laws, for example, and I hit the white ball into the 12 ball, and the 12 ball just flew up into the air and did a bunch of circles and flew out the window, that would be no less surprising than if it went into the pocket. The only reason we know the same thing will happen every time is because physical laws explain how things work. So this is interesting, and it's actually a problem that has affected philosophy really since ancient times. It's a problem um, about freedom more generally. But as soon as physics is the kind of thing which says, okay, whenever you have a certain event, another event will follow. That event follows with certainty using physical laws, which can be calculated mathematically. And if you know the initial state of a system and the energy input into that system and the physical parameters of that energy, you can determine the output state, which is just another way of saying, I know if I'm holding a ball and I drop it, it's going to fall at 9.8 meters per second, and then it's going to come back up relative to the elasticity and the transfer of energy with the surface it hits. Okay, cool, physics. Maybe physics is boring to a lot of people. What would physics possibly have to do with human morality? And why might physics even be seen as a threat to human morality, to the very idea of ethics? Looks like it's totally unrelated so far. I feel like I heard part of an answer. Why might the story we're telling of the world, where the world follows these laws of physics, which are determined, happen the same every time, why would this be thought of as a threat to ethics?
Kind of throwing this one out there, but is it because some of the attempts at making ethics arbitrary?
Okay, so it might make ethics somewhat arbitrary. Um, why arbitrary?
Uh, well, as animals, we're subject to the laws of nature, our own kind of chemical, reactionary perspective of life. how well does that balance against kind of like a super ego kind of effect on us?
Okay. Okay. So we are kind of human animals. Human animals are subject to of laws of nature. I think that's a good point. Why is that a threat to the kinds of ethical philosophies we've seen so far, or to the possibility of us being ethical creatures if we are animals kind of subject to the laws of nature? I know some of you out there have thought about this question before. For some of you, it sounds strange. I think Michael at least has a start on this. If we start thinking of ourselves, or as everything that happens in the world, as happening according to laws of nature, that doesn't leave a lot of room for human freedom and human choice. If you think about what ethics is all about what we do, the consequences of our actions, and the choices that we make. So let's assume that I am something like a neurobiologist. Anyone out there taking psych, what is that? Psych 5, I think.
Brain, mind, and behavior.
Yes, that
It's
one.
like 4.
4, okay, cool. Now, I have never taken that class with Ernie. I've taken a version of it myself. But this, well, tell me about this then, Corey. Why do I have to know about my brain in order to know about behavior? What's the link?
Well, I think that the link in this case with choice is there are certain things that are chemical reactions in our brain that affect behavior, and that kind of comes into play when you're questioning if people have choice and free will.
Yeah, good point. When I was a psych major back in the day at UCLA, and I would go to my professor's office hours after class, I didn't meet a single one who focused on like the biology of the brain, or really who focused on cognition, or who focused on the sociology of behavior, who thought we had free will. Every single psychologist who I talked to about it, who was a research psychologist, not like a clinical psychologist, thought free will was an illusion because there are laws that determine what happens. Just like billiard balls are made out of physical stuff, our brains are made out of physical stuff. And if you've taken Psych 4, you know that every action that we take is a result of these neurochemical events start in our brain. An electrical signal goes down our brainstem and makes us act. Sometimes those acts can even be predicted ahead of time before we know what we're going to do. It might be possible for electrodes on our brain to look at those centers in our brain and know what we're going to act before we've, from our point of view, made a choice. Put it differently, if it's the chemical organization of our brain that determines how we act, then it's difficult to say I act because I chose it, or to say I could have chosen something differently, because the behavior, just like the billiard balls of chemicals, is also well understood and follows laws of physics, ignoring for certain issues in contemporary physics that we can only discuss. We can discuss if you want to, but might not be relevant for us. So isn't my brain, as a physical thing, just subject to the laws of physics? And if so, doesn't that mean I never really choose and I'm never really responsible for what happens? The answer for why I did anything is just my brain made me do it. My brain followed the laws of physics, and so I did what I was going to do. Or a more simplistic version, talking about chemicals, I have the biochemistry I have. I didn't choose my brain's biochemistry. My brain's biochemistry determined my action, and so I'm not responsible. What do you think about this so far? At least in cases of abnormal psychology, we sometimes say this, like, that person wasn't responsible. Their brain chemistry made them do it. But all of us have brain chemistry, and all of us have brains that act just like the brain of someone with abnormal psychology, that are resulting in our behavior. Any preliminary thoughts about this? How can we be free if we're made out of physical stuff, including brains, that determine our action? It's a big, hard question, and one that, because this is an ethics class, we haven't thought much about. What do you think? Corey, I hate to put you on the spot on this, so you can not answer if you want to, but I wonder what you think after going through Psych 4. Did it change your point of view on whether or not we have freedom? Did it make you think, well, in some cases, maybe we're partially less free, maybe we're not free, maybe there's freedom that exists alongside our brain?
Yeah, I think I also took abnormal psych, and I think with both of them combined, I feel like there are limitations that our brains have that affect our choices, but I don't necessarily believe that there's no such thing as free will or choice. But I think that a lot of brain chemistry does have an effect on that, and it does limit our choices.
Interestingly. And I think that if we're pressed, probably most of us would have to agree with that you can't say your culture or your brain or your psychology, whatever it is, doesn't affect your choice. But most of us are not willing to get rid of the very idea of free will. Is there anyone who would say differently? Is there anyone who thinks that freedom of choice is just an illusion? Interestingly, it's not just physical views that sometimes impel this, right? There are these classical questions like, God already knows everything you're going to do, so everything you're going to do is determined. It's like a religious version of the same problem. The one Kant was interested in, though, is just this problem that a lot of modern philosophers, which means like after 1800, were worried about. If the physical world is controlled by physical law, how can there be freedom? So here's an example of what that threat might look like. I've kind of gone over this already, so I'll go quickly through this. We could say that my brain causes the actions in my body. My brain follows the laws of chemistry and physics. The laws of chemistry and physics have no exceptions, so I couldn't have done other than what I did. So how does Kant respond to this problem? Kant responds to this problem by saying that there are two kinds of causation in the world, two kinds of ways that things happen. All actions, Kant wants to say, of humans follow physical and psychological laws and therefore are not free unless we choose to follow the moral law instead. So you can think about any action that I might take. Why did I eat? I ate. Well, can anyone give me a version of this? Give me a physical law account or explanation for why I chose to eat. If you're looking at my brain, why would you explain the fact that I ate, I don't know, Fruit Loops this morning?
Dopamine.
Okay, Fruit Loops are full of sugar and carbs, and I'm gonna get a dopamine rush when I eat those Fruit Loops, and that's why I chose them. If I'm looking at myself as a physical system. Then Kant wants to say for any action that you take, if it's an action that's following your desire, like we saw before, it's just an action that happens because of your animal nature and the rules of the animal nature, which are physical rules. But Kant thinks that there are some times when we follow a moral law instead of just letting our brains and our psychology determine what will happen. But those are the only explanations possible on Kantian ethics. So Kant wants to say that acting morally and acting freely are the same thing. So this is an interesting part of Kant's system. Kant thinks the only time you're actually free, by which he means literally free to choose, the choice that you made was the result of your own action. The only time that your action is free is when you're following the moral law or acting morally. So let's assume that I broke my neighbor's window and I told the truth to my neighbor. I broke your window. Now Kant wants to say, if you want to explain your behavior, that behavior has to be subsumed under some law, which explains why certain effects follow from certain actions. Now, one obvious law would be something to do with, well, I had a certain emotion. One emotion had more force than the other. There are laws of energy and human psychology that determined why. Let's say my guilt or my fear was strong enough that I told my neighbor because I didn't want him to find out later and to punish me. So that was my human emotion interacting to determine what I would do. Kant doesn't think it's free because it just happened inside of me. And the action that I took was just a result of whichever desire happened to be there, with more energy or more power or more force. On the other hand, Kant thinks that it is possible for us to, if you will, rise above just the determination of our psychology and to do something just because it's right. In this case, the explanation is, I did it because it was right. You remember from before that Kant thinks that when you do something you don't want to do, it's in a especially effective case of freedom and morality because you know you did it just because it was right. So in option 2, I did it because I chose to follow the moral law. Therefore, I did it freely, and therefore it was my choice because I chose to do something other than just let my pre-existing emotion and psychology, which might reduce down to just my brain state, determine what I would do. This is the key issue for Kant, which the first time you hear it, it just sounds like I'm not saying anything. Over time, it might start to make more sense. You let your body and your psychology and physics determine what you'll do, or you step outside of that and do it because you're doing it because it's right. Kant doesn't think you act out of right ever because of emotion or because of pre-existing psychology. Acting because it's right is its own principle because it goes against, you're fighting against your desire, or at least you're not letting your desire determine what you do. So we talked about this a little bit, but why is it that for Kant, following our desires is not an example of freedom? Well, Kant would say what you do if you're following desire is just that your strongest desire will always win. So your action is the result of whatever desire you had. You didn't choose that desire. That desire is just there. So if you follow desire, your action isn't really chosen. It's just the result of what's already in you. Only ethical consideration can overrule what our desires would otherwise choose for us. Okay, so we're getting closer to this idea. Any questions so far about what this would mean or what Kant's trying to get at? Okay. So conversely then, we also discussed this a bit. Why is following the moral law not an example of being determined instead of being free? Well, like we saw before, we don't choose the laws of nature. These are just have to do with our physical nature, our deterministic laws of human psychology and things like that. But we do choose the law or the principle that we'll follow for ethics, which is we choose to follow the moral law. And for Kant, why is it that following the moral law is an example of freedom? Well, that's what following morality means for Kant. The moral law is just a combination of when you choose according to universal principles. Another way of saying this is just that the moral law is the law which comes out of the very idea of choosing according to universal principles. And I feel like I haven't hit this idea as much as I should have, because it gets back to the idea that moral laws must be universal. Maybe we can open this discussion up a little bit more. You guys are kind of quiet today. But is there anyone out there who thinks And this is a very general question. We'll bring it back to Kant after that. Is there anyone out there who thinks that there are certain moral principles that always apply as true? Anyone willing to say, here's a principle I think just is universally true. Thou shalt not X, or you must always Y. And it can have a situation built into it, like you should always X, assuming Y. But is there anyone there who thinks that here's a universal principle?
You should always be nice to someone until they do something bad.
This seems like a really good principle. It goes back really to like John Locke and the founding of our country. Maybe the most basic ethical principle is like, be nice to someone, especially in the negative sense of don't like be mean to them actively or harm them unless they have posed a threat to you or done something aggressive to you, right? Basically, don't be aggressive unless someone else is being aggressive, or maybe be beneficent, be kind, unless someone else has given you reason to think that they don't deserve that. Okay, this sounds like a pretty universal principle, and in fact, it's very close to one of Kant's universal principles. He's going to like this. Now, tell me, if you don't mind, Terry, why do you think this, what makes you think that this is a principle that should always be followed?
Because if you do something nice to someone, then generally it'll make everyone else happy by continuously spreading from one person to another, sort of like that.
Fair enough. So we can see that a lot of good results come from it. And one of those results is just more kindness. So the idea that kindness is good, kindness seems to be built into the principle. And Kant is going to say, Kant believes that ethics only makes sense in a world where there are universal rules. In other words, if I said something like, you ought to be kind to me, Kant thinks that only makes any sense at all if what I'm really saying is something like what Terry said. There is a universal principle of kindness, and because I haven't been aggressive toward you, you should not be aggressive toward me. So the idea here is that even a single ethical claim, according to Kant, relies on universal ethical principles. So if I was to say something like, you should be kind to me, and let's say this is an ethical claim, that claim only makes sense if there is a universal rule explaining why you must be kind in this case. So Kant is trying hard here to say that morality, to make sense at all, has to be a matter of universal principles. If you tell me that I should be kind to you, Kant thinks that implied in that is the idea that you should, in general, be kind to me as well, because there's no reason that that ethical claim, I should be kind to you, would have any force at all or be explicable in any way unless there's a broader principle that applies to this specific case. Now, we saw that Kant isn't saying you should always be kind or something like that, but a principle like Terry's, and we'll see how it kind of expands later on, Kant would say there has to be something like that in the background. It can have caveats, but if you said something like, you should be kind to me, but I don't have to be kind to you, end of story, Kant says that makes no sense at all if what you mean is morally should. There's no reason that that ethical claim would hold unless there's a principle that explains it. Otherwise, if I say, why should I be kind? That's just the end of the story, and there's no explanation for why that has to be. So ethical principles, just like in the case of the billiard balls for Kant, I can only explain why one ball hit another and it went straight if there are universal rules of physics that explain what happens. If the ball did really just go up into the air and do a twirl and fly out the window, there would be no explanation it just would be inconceivable, because we can't talk about why things happen without referring back to universal rules. The same thing is true of any individual ethical act for Kant. If there's not a rule that explains why it's a rule, ethics just doesn't make sense. In fact, even thinking about that principle where the ball flies up and goes around, you're probably thinking, okay, well, maybe there was, I don't know, an unusual meteorological event that caused it to happen. We're already trying to think of physical laws that would explain it, because without a law or a principle that explains it, it's just an unintelligible event. In the same way that ethics on Kant's view is unintelligible if there aren't rules that explain why it's true. Now, what these rules are, we're going to talk about next lecture, and really the lecture after that. Next lecture is a pretty formal version of this account. The lecture after that is a less formal version. Okay. This is a lot of tough stuff that all kind of feeds together into itself. Are there any, oh, I see some chats here as well. So let me take a look at these. So someone says, it reminds me of the concept of Lord of the Flies. Without societal standards, in Kant's view, this would be the moral law, humans revert to their animal nature. That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, and Kant would actually be sensitive to that idea as well. One way he explains it is that Kant says, human beings are a kingdom of ends. And the only time we go past our animal nature is when we're working together to give everyone freedom of choice and respect. Without that, it's just human psychology doing what we do. And someone else says, treat other people the way you want to be treated, as a good version of the principle we were talking about. And I think that can also be thought of definitely as sort of the fundamental ethical rule. Okay, any questions about this stuff? I know this stuff is difficult because I know when I give this lecture in class, there's about 60% of the students who are like, what just happened? Is there anything I can do to explain it more, or any examples you would want or clarifications? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these difficult ideas stemming from Kant. And let's talk a little bit more about some of these difficult ideas stemming from Kant and the ideas in this week's lecture. There's this interrelationship between the ideas of freedom, physical laws, the moral law, universal laws, causation and explanation, emotions, freedom, and physical law. And these are just the prompts that you're given for preparing for this week's quiz. So let's start with the idea of physical laws. We covered this in the lecture as well as all these ideas, but this is just a backup if you find this more useful or if you need more examples and explanation. So when it comes to physical laws, Kant's idea is that physical law explains everything that occurs within the physical universe. In fact, Kant thinks that for the most part, events are just completely unintelligible unless they fall under laws of some type. So in the lecture, we gave the example of something like billiard balls falling, or let's imagine that I'm asking myself, what would happen if I dropped my glasses here? Everyone knows that if I hold my glasses above the earth somewhere and drop them, they're going to fall. And if I asked you, why did those glasses fall? Everyone is going to give me the same answer, probably if they're above third grade level. The answer they're going to give is it fell because of gravity. So we have an event here. The event is just the glasses falling. And then that event has a certain explanation. And the explanation works because it references a universal law. Gravity makes things fall down. Another way of saying this is just to say that in any event of this type, which is basically in any event where there are two objects, one of them is very massive, and they're near each other, they are going to move toward each other inversely proportional to their mass and distance and such, right? But the key idea here is just that the only reason this object falling was explicable in that scenario is because we could give a universal law according to which this type of event always happens in these types of circumstances. Imagine that the law of gravity wasn't there, and sometimes I released my glasses, they flew up into the air, sometimes they did a twirl and flew out the window, and this was just a random series of different kinds of reactions. In a situation like that, if my glasses did a twist and flew out the window and someone said why, it would literally be an inexplicable event because there is no law determining what happens in these kinds of situations. So Kant has an argument that the very possibility of explanation for a physical event requires that we can subsume that physical event as falling under physical laws, which determine what happens in these types of events. We can't explain that something caused something else unless we can say one event followed another because of these laws which determine that that second event would follow. So that's physical laws. But Kant is going to say the same thing must be true about moral law as well. So now onto the moral law. Imagine a situation where you're trying to explain what someone ought to do and why. Let's say your kid brother got angry over some trivial thing and decided to hit his friend Jim. You talk to your kid brother and he says, "Why can't I hit Jim? Explain to me why I can't do that, why it's morally not okay." In order to explain to your kid brother, on Kant's view, why that was wrong, you would need some kind of a universal principle to explain the wrongness of that act. In this case, you probably say something like, well, other people deserve to be respected and treated with kindness, except in certain perhaps intervening circumstances, right? So the reason it's not okay to hit Jim is because this is an event of the type which is doing harm to other people in an unkind way that wasn't justified by what they did to you. We have the individual event. You did this to Jim. That event is of the kind wrong, and we explain that event by subsuming it under a moral law, which shows that these kinds of things are wrong. This also explains why, for Kant, moral laws have to be universal laws. Because if they're not laws that explain what would apply to anyone who's in a similar situation, then they don't really explain anything. So let's imagine that your kid brother hit Jim and you explain why it was wrong. The next day, your kid brother hits Tim in a very similar situation for the same reason in the same way. And your kid brother says, "Was that wrong?" And you say, "No, in this case, it was fine." Nothing about the situation, just like one was wrong, one was right, even though they're basically the same kind of thing. In this case, your original claim that hitting Jim was wrong because it was an act of unprovoked unkindness, the explanation completely falls apart, because if another act of similar unkindness wasn't also wrong, then your principle, which was used to explain why the first act was wrong, just falls apart. In other words, if it was wrong to take an act that was unprovoked unkindness, if those kinds of acts are wrong, then it should apply in any similar case, because that's what a law, and that's just how explanation works in general on Kant's view. The universal principle, a general principle, explains a specific case. And for the most part, when we explain things, that's how we will explain them. So Kant's going to say that both physical and moral laws must be universal laws. They must be laws which apply in all similar situations if there's going to be explanation at all. And we'll see it's not just about explanation for Kant, but it's also about causation. Causation is just the idea that one event causes another event. And as we saw in the lecture, Kant thinks that that's necessary for explanation, an explanation is closely related to causation. And this gets to the idea that Kant believes that there are only two kinds of causation that exist, at least in the human universe. Some things happen because they're following physical laws. Some things happen because they're following moral laws. Now, Kant does not believe that acts that follow physical laws are free. Why? Because we don't choose those acts. I chose to release my glasses, but I didn't choose that they fall, right? I couldn't have chosen to stop that law. I didn't choose that the law of gravity is there. The law of gravity is there whether I chose it or not. So physical laws are not an example of freedom. They happen whether we choose it or not. We can't choose the law. We can't undo the law of gravity. And it's important to point out that for Kant, when I'm following my normal psychology, including my desires are within this system of physical law, my physical psychology. They are bound by these laws of causation on Kant's view that are outside of my own choice and moral act. So Kant thinks your psychology, when we do psychology from the point of view of a scientific perspective, or when we do psychology at all, what we're doing is explaining our behavior by putting it under these laws that we didn't choose. The individual psychology of Kant doesn't matter that much, but think of any psychological theory that we have. Almost all of them are going to say, you took this act because of this, let's say, biochemical event in your brain. You did this act because of this sociological conditioning that you were given. You did this act because of this thing that happened in your childhood. All of these kinds of explanation are saying you took act X because event Y, which you didn't control, happened before that. And this psychological principle is also one you didn't choose. According to most psychological theories, what they're going to say is this is just a law of how people behave. So if I'm explaining my behavior on Kant's view using my desire or anything else, let alone physical law, right? If I'm explaining my behavior by using my neurochemistry, what happens in my brain, those things follow laws of chemistry, laws of physics that determine how a neurochemical signal gets sent down my neurons and eventually ends in me acting. So in Kant's view, anytime I act, if it's not explicable by the moral law, it's going to be explicable by physical laws. And the only kinds of actions that people take, that humans take, are following the moral law and following physical law. Everything else that we see in the world around us, right, is just following physical laws. A rock isn't choosing to fall from the sky. It just follows physical laws. Human beings follow those same natural laws, except when they follow the moral law. Why do we know that any action must follow one or the other, the physical or the moral law? Because, like we saw earlier, Kant believes that explanation only exists at all in a realm where laws determine how actions will occur. So that basic explanation requires that there's a law explaining some event. Okay, so then how is the moral law different? Kant believes that if I follow the moral law, I'm actually determining the law according to which I will act. So I don't determine the law of gravity, the laws of momentum and propulsion, or any other kinds of laws, biochemistry. I don't determine any of these laws. They exist and I cannot change them. But with the action that I take, if I follow the moral law, Kant says I can choose the moral law. For example, I can choose the principle upon which I act, even though I can't choose those other physical things. So Kant believes that in cases where I follow this higher law, the moral law, which as we'll see later on is something like treat all people as full rational agents who deserve respect. When I follow that principle, now my behavior can be explained by that principle. And now that act was actually an act of freedom because I chose the law that I acted on rather than it being a pre-existing law of my psychology or something else. I chose the principle I was going to act on, and I took that act as a result of choosing that principle. It still has to fall under a law, but that law is the moral law, and I chose the moral law. So that's why acts are free in the case of morality, moral acts that follow the moral law, according to Kant. But everything's going to follow a law. It's just a law that I chose. Those are the free things. A law I didn't choose. Those are the unfree things. Okay, so I'm looking back at the list here. The interrelationship of freedom, physical laws, the moral laws, universal laws, causation and explanation. And the last prompt here is emotions, freedom, and the physical law. So we can see now how all of these things fit together. Emotions, for Kant, are a part of my psychology. They're a part of those things that are explained by the physical, causal processes in the ordinary world. Even if those things are primarily mental events, they're not really physical events, they're still going to fall under these causal patterns for Kant, which mean that they are deterministic. My psychology is just as deterministic for Kant as is billiard balls hitting each other or glasses falling with the law of gravity. So if I follow my emotions, like we saw last time, Kant believes I didn't choose my emotions just happen, and then I follow whichever emotion happens to be stronger and wins out. But that's not a story where I ever choose anything on Kant's view, because my emotions were already there. My emotions battle each other out for primacy, and the one with the most force wins. I didn't choose to have those emotions, and I didn't choose which one's stronger. And so in a way, I'm just kind of going with the flow, which for Kant is against freedom. The only time I act freely is when I say, regardless of the emotions, I'm going to act on this principle, which is the principle of morality, the moral law, respect all persons. And when I act according to the moral law, I'm getting beyond those things that already exist in me as determined factors. I'm setting up the law that I will follow, which determines what my act will be. And so that's a case of freedom. And that's why for Kant, he doesn't believe that freedom can come with emotional actions. Okay, well, the synopsis is in response to quite a few questions that I got from quite a few students asking for clarifications on these ideas. If it helps you understand the ideas, that's great. Hope the quiz goes well for you, and good luck with all the material this week.